So thank you everybody so much for coming. Just before we start, if I can get the screen, there we go. I'd like to just go over a quick few ground rules. No slurs. We anticipate that some questions might be difficult, but if you start asking like inappropriate, like sexual questions, we might reserve the right to just deem it inappropriate. And this is a strictly judgment-free zone. We will be answering questions to the best of our abilities, and it is a safe discussion space, so please feel free to ask questions during the Q&A as you see fit. So, introducing our panellists. I might get you all to introduce yourselves, and you're in order, so that's super helpful. So, Charlie?
Don't you want to introduce yourself?
Huh? Oh, I'm Sav. I am a transgender man who seems to have become a transgender specialist. I know a lot on the subject, and I do a lot of sensitivity work surrounding it, so I thought it was about time that I brought it to games specifically. Yeah. And I'm a designer and a writer and sometimes a producer. Charlie?
Hello, I'm Charlie. Charlie Francis Cassidy, if you want my full, long, pretentious name.
We do.
Hey. I am non-binary transmasculine. I work for Queerly Represent Me as a consultant on non-binary stuff and a bunch of other queer stuff because I'm hella queer. I work as a programmer at Mighty Games, and I like floral, as you can all see. Or can everyone see? Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
That's me.
Sorry, what was that queerly? That first one you work for?
Queerly Represent Me.
Hi, I'm Snow. I am agender. I am a writer, narrative designer, and angry person on the internet. I do a lot of freelance stuff, and I am angry that the concept of gender exists. So, that's me.
Hey, I'm Damon. I'm a narrative designer, non-binary. Sometimes I have gender, sometimes I don't. It varies. It's confusing. I don't understand it, but I just feel like dissatisfied. I make stories. I also do non-binary advocacy with Charlie and Mayes Wallen, and a fantastic community. We try and make things better.
I think we do.
Yeah. Well, that's me and that's us.
Hi, I'm Daunt, trans woman. What did I write up there? I seem to have
Not
cut,
a lot. You were very tired that day.
Yeah, I seem to have cut half my job titles off and then added another one. But I do games lecturing at SAE. I do programming. I write. The only thing I don't do in games is art or audio because both of those require more dexterity and typing is a lot easier. Also, sometimes I do speak. Why the hell not?
Yeah.
So that's me.
Yeah. I thought today we would kick things off with a quick lightning round, so 1 or 2 sentences to answer each of these questions. You're just going to have to throw the mic at each other. So, how do I ask someone's pronouns?
You say, excuse me, what are your pronouns? If that's not too much to ask. Or something along those lines. Just be polite. In fact, it's nice. Wait, I've gone over 2 sentences. I'm going to keep going.
Faye!
It works if you ask people's pronouns even if you assume them because it normalizes the whole behavior. That's
Yeah.
Do we need to expand on this?
No.
Ask everyone their pronouns. It's very easy. Hi, what are your pronouns?
I like to introduce myself with mine. So when I introduce myself to people, I go, hi, I'm Sav, my pronouns are he, him. And then they can introduce themselves in kind as well.
Just one additional thing. Maybe don't use what are your preferred pronouns. A lot of people find that, well, your pronouns are your pronouns. They're not like a preference.
Preferable, yeah. What do I do if I mess up someone's pronouns?
You just switch to the right pronouns and don't make a big deal out of it. Just like brush it off. And if they say something, then you apologize. Otherwise, it's fine. It happens. Move on.
It's okay to say oops. Like that's fine. Like
Yeah.
as long as you if you keep messing it up, like just like acknowledge that, be like, hey, I'm doing my best.
Not defensively.
Not
Yeah.
defensively. You want to come at it from a direction of like, hey, I'm working on it, but also please work harder.
As someone who has had a lot of people transition in their life, I mess it up when they first transition. That's fine. You just want to get better. It's not about like you made a mistake. The two worst things you can do is say, oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Everyone, did you hear I just got those pronouns wrong? I'm so sorry. Or the one where you say the wrong pronouns and then you go, sorry, it was you, I chose that. And you just stare at them, making it the most awkward situation possible. One apology if needed, get it right, move on.
I'm just going to say you don't know what two sentences is.
I set word limits, I don't limit myself.
How do I make my workplace bathrooms inclusive?
Let me pass it to someone else, because I feel like all three of you
Yeah.
are better.
Actually, I feel like shouldn't you answer this question?
Possibly. Probably the best way to go about it is if you can't physically alter the building or like alter the signage, like you don't own it or it's a rental or something like that, just put some signs over your signs that say bathroom with urinal or bathroom with stalls, and then you don't have to gender them, and it's much easier for everyone involved, as well as making sure you have things like sanitary bins for pads in all of the bathrooms and, you know, tampons in all of the bathrooms kind of thing. It just makes it a lot easier.
Do you want to add something?
Trans people want to pee the same as everyone else. Let them pee.
No. How do I know if someone is trans?
Wait. Why do you have to know? There we go.
There.
So I think this, it's important to note, like, it's okay to be curious, but also think about, like, why you're asking that question, like, and why it's so important for you to know that, because in the end, it's not really your business as to whether someone is trans or cis or basically anything about their gender or assigned gender at birth, whatever. Like, that's not super important unless you're a doctor, and even then, it's like
Only for certain things.
only for very
Yeah.
certain things.
Very specific reasons. All right. What is a non-binary person?
Me.
You're off the panel.
This is not really as complicated as it sounds. Like, some people just don't fit into, aren't comfortable with, or actively reject the ideas of being male or female. It's as simple as that. Some people aren't either one of those. Some people are both or move between them. It is, as it says on the box, it is not binary.
Yeah, that was really good. So we're going to get into some of the longer questions, even though we've already been into some of the longer questions. Now, all of these that were submitted were completely anonymous as well. And if you want to send in some, there is a hashtag you can be sending them to, and I'll be looking at my phone while people are talking.
My head's blocking.
Move your head.
Look, I'm just going to be awkwardly to one side. There you go.
Yeah.
Do we smell?
So rude. Is it better to be explicit or not when writing a trans character to make their transness a forefront?
I'm going to remember.
Don't. No, there's more, sorry. Please don't write please don't specifically say this character is trans. Like, using those words specifically is probably unnecessary in your story. I don't know. Maybe make it come up in a more natural way. Like, I remember, was it Hacknet, where you go through some files and you find someone's on testosterone? Or...
Yeah. I can go into that. So I worked on the expansion to a game called Hacknet, and I wanted to put a trans character in, but like not in a like exploitative, like very, very ham-fisted way. I left sort of contextual clues that if someone is like familiar with like the trans masc experience or like a trans masc experience, they could connect those dots and be like, hey, this person is probably trans. Stuff like a testosterone prescription, just general hints in their journals, but nothing like, I hate my body and want to change it, or I'm trans and everyone's mean to me about it. Like that's stuff that happens, but it's also like such a cliched way to write a trans character. So if you have to do it, like, do it subtly. Oh, do you have a question?
Question?
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm sort of curious what the panel's opinion on when it comes to that kind of representation in games or stories. I hear like a lot of people, or at least trans people, more interested in having sort of a character that's more concrete in saying that I am trans and whatnot, and they don't really appreciate just like loose threads being tied together. Like, what's your opinion on that? Because like, is it better to say clearly, or is it better to sort of leave it ambiguous?
I think it's good to ask a trans person. Like, if you're going to write a trans character and you're not trans, just ask someone, like, hey, like, put it on Twitter, like, hey, can a trans person look over this thing for me? Because I'm trying to make it a respectful representation. Because, like,
more than one,
yeah,
I would say.
Yes, please, more than one. Because we're not a monolith. We all like different things.
What? Who said? Thought we were all one person.
Sorry, I didn't catch that through the hive mind. Can you say it again? But yeah, it's messy as hell. Like, I'm not going to say that it's easy to write a trans character, or that there's like one solution that's going to make everyone happy. And so you will face a risk there. But I think in the end, it's better to have a slightly flawed representation than like a super offensive one that's had no consultation done on it.
Yeah, I think there's a few things, like why you want to include a trans character is important. Like, if you're including it because you want to be like have a more diverse cast, if you want to, you know, include representation because it's important to you, or you just think it's a good thing to do, then again, like, consult, ask, but like, if it's not super important to sort of put on a big neon sign that says this character is trans, then it's probably going to come across as uncomfortable. But if it's something that isn't confirmed in the text at all, and then you sort of J.K. Rowling it after and be like, ah, totally trans, that one, then you also haven't done jack shit. So it's very much about, like, what are you trying to do by including the character, and how is the best way to achieve that goal in a way that isn't going to alienate anyone. And also, no matter what you do, some people are going to get upset because the trans experience is almost universally crap. That's like the one thing that everyone can share is everyone has some things that are really, really difficult, and there are times you're going to tread on toes because it's all very painful and hurts a lot for a lot of people. So be prepared for that, and be prepared to sort of cop to that. If you do it, someone's like, hey, that hurt, just say sorry.
In terms of explicitness of defining the trans character, you have a spectrum. I just got to open this to remember the name. You have a spectrum I like to call the Abrams Dumbledore spectrum, right? So we have Dumbledore obviously just being on the LGBTIQ kind of group and not necessarily trans. You have Dumbledore with no indication within the text, and then the writer just like says in an interview, oh, they're gay. And then you have Abrams from Mass Effect Andromeda, where they walk up to you and go, hello, I am trans. Those are the two extremes. You want somewhere in between. The best way to do it is to actually create a character that has a past and find out, for example, with the testosterone thing, that is something that they would have gone through, that would have been relative to the character. They could have backstory including any number of shitty trans situations that could come up more naturally in text and not be a huge neon flag, but still give you the right impression. I mean, representation is important, and I'm sure we'd all like to see more representation in games, just not Hanley Abrams.
Oh, and don't dead name. I don't have
Yeah,
the
don't
right-
do that. Don't do that.
We don't need to know
What is
anyone's
dead name?
transition name.
Yeah, should we do a what is dead name? It's very quick.
Dead naming is some or many trans people choose to change their names once they sort of figure out their gender ID. And the previous name that they were assigned at birth, or the one they used before, often, if not usually, is one that they would rather leave behind. And so if you know a trans person and they change their name, one of the most important things and one of the most one of the biggest acts of allyship is to drop that old name as quickly as you can, because often that can be a significant anchor in especially like mentally, like staying back in that state where they were before.
To give you an idea, 3 people in the state know my dead name, and they've all signed blood packs.
Send it to the mic.
Oh, I don't want to repeat the joke. This whole thing.
All right, I'm going to move on. If somebody in the industry if somebody has worked in the industry before transitioning, is it okay to ask about their dead name so you can search their previous job titles?
Employment is the most difficult part. If you are trying to hire someone, you do need history, but I don't see any problem in asking for the history from the person and letting them provide it.
I would say
Things from-
talking to their referees instead, like their
Yeah.
references, and just asking for additional references rather than going the dead name route.
Just use the last name when you're asking to hire.
Yeah.
It's a safer option.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any suggestions?
Yeah, I'll just, there's like a lot of different contexts where this might be relevant. If you are looking to hire a trans person, they've probably thought about it and included whatever you need on the resume. And if you have questions, there are easier ways to ask than like, hey, I can tell you're trans, what was your old name? That's a crap way. But like, oh, I'm going to follow up with these I tried to follow up with a reference and they didn't know anyone by this name. Open-ended question, maybe. But also, like, if you're meeting someone, like, at an event, at a party or something, and you're like, oh, what have you worked on? You can just ask that. You don't need to necessarily be like, oh, I know this person is trans and has been in the industry for a while, but I don't know their old name, or I thought I knew their old name, but I can't remember it, or something. Just don't ask the question. You do not, under most circumstances, need to know, and if you do need to know, let them volunteer it.
Question?
Can I add to that? I think that it's not relevant to ask the dead name, or however you want, birth name, whatever, okay? Because that person's going to have their up-to-date LinkedIn
Yeah.
and whatever. So you will find out what you need to find out because they'll be prepared.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessary.
And they may even have things like, I earned like this bachelor degree, and then have as like a sub-note under a different name. And that's kind of all you need to know. It's like when someone gets married, kind of thing, and they change their last name. Anything else on that one? No? All right. When writing a trans character, is it simpler to write them just with their current identified gender in mind, or are there constraints to be made about their previous experience as what they were born as? Sorry, that one's the two-parter. when not plot relevant, are there any common personality differences specifically for people who are trans? One example might be that how they've internalized or dealt with marginalization during their life or other societal impacts.
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think the shortest version that I can give is if it's not relevant to the story, don't bring it to the surface. Again, consult, ask trans people, especially if you can find people with similar-ish experiences. Be like, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm trying to do, this is the kind of experience I'm trying to convey. What would you consider important to include? What would you want to see? What would you not want to see? There's no like universal answer for like this is the absolute right or wrong way to handle a trans character. It depends on the story, it depends on the person, it depends on their identity, it depends on like what the writer is trying to do. So that's the vague answer. Do people want to start chiseling away at that?
In terms of like shared experiences from trans people, it's kind of like if you tried to write all gay men the same way, you would get in massive trouble for stereotyping. If you tried to write every African American the same way, once again, that's horrific. That should be the same for all kind of minorities. And past experiences differ from country to country. In the US, there's lots of threats of violence, lots of, what was that? And I'm pretty sure it was a bad stat, but there was a stat being passed around that I think 1 in 13 trans people.
1 in 12.
Oh,
Yeah.
it went.
It was 1 in 12, yeah.
1 in 12 trans people in America get murdered.
Yeah.
So, in Australia, luckily, usually what we have to suffer from is bogans in cars who yell as they drive past. I think that is my most common experience.
Yeah.
We don't tend to have as much violence, although I'm sure we've all suffered from some at some point. But there is, the only shared experience and personality is going through a shitty time.
Yeah.
So yeah, once again, I go back to the idea of writing your character's past and building off that. Make them a person, don't make them a shell that rotates around the idea of representation.
Yeah, don't make them a cardboard cutout of what you think a like trans person should look like, basically. Like start with a person and then build from that.
Also, just as a side note, I heard game man instead of gay man, and I was like, but those stereotypes are written all the time, and people are fine with that. Sorry, you got a question?
Would it be okay if I could ask one from the audience?
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. I'm just also curious, like, because we're all here because we love video games or work in video games. What do you think are like? What are your favorite, I guess, like trans characters in media, and what are your least favorite sort of representations, like for each of you? If you don't mind, like answering that.
Does anyone have an immediate answer?
I'm just going to repeat the question.
Yeah.
Going through our favourite and least favourite representations of trans characters in media. Yeah. I can start.
Yeah.
Do you have one?
Yeah, the one I wrote in my game. So I wrote a game.
Can we get the URL for that?
Huh?
Can we get the name and the URL?
You can get the name. It's called That Boy is a Monster. It's won 2 awards and been nominated for an extra 2. And it is about dating while being a gay trans masculine man. So the main character is trans, so obviously I'm very fond of that representation.
How did you find the inspiration for that?
Kellogg's.
Was that made in Game Jam?
No, that was actually a different one. All of my games are trans related, so if you ever want any of that, just follow me on Twitter. And I gotta say my least favorite, I'm sorry to Dragon Age fans, but it's gotta be Krem. Just because Krem's whole character is specifically about him being trans and how awful that's been for him his whole life. and is voiced by a woman. So it kind of wasn't good on any account.
Krem felt a lot like desperately scrambling to be like, hey, look, we included a trans person because we're so good and diverse, and I guess you did more than most people, but you're not getting a cookie for that. The only one that I thought of immediately, which is like very... This is not necessarily a good one, but one that had potential. If anyone played Catherine, the game by Atlas, there is a very mixed handling of it in which a sort of like love interest of one of the characters is trans and not explicitly said, but a bunch of the characters already know because they went to school with her before she transitioned, and their friend is interested in her. They're all quite awful about it. They're all like, hey, you don't want to date her. She's not your type. And he's like, no, fuck off. She's great. And they ultimately like sleep together, and he sort of comes back to his group of friends, and they're all like, oh, you did it. How was it? And he's like, yeah, it was cool. She's great. I like it. And they're all like, oh, which is almost good. That character is good. But also the game revolves around men getting stuck in a weird psychic prison of blocks and sheep. And she gets sent there because they fucked up real bad. So it's not good, but they handle one particular element better than I've seen a lot of games do it. So there you go. It's both the best and the worst that I can think of off the top of my head.
She also gets dead named in the credits.
Oh, good.
Oh.
Atlas has never been good with representation.
No.
What was the title of that game?
That's Catherine with a C. Yeah.
Just to give you an idea on why we're having so much trouble, if you Google best trans representation in games, Krem is 2. So that should give you
Is
an idea.
Birdo 1?
Huh?
Is Birdo 1?
The one I saw, no, it wasn't. It was Chrono Trigger.
Ah. There is a like trans Pokemon trainer somewhere.
That's
Yes.
right, because they changed between the games.
Yes.
There's not much representation in media, and I think a lot of us tend to cling more to developers and writers and like actors who kind of move forward with that. Like I was watching, what's the name of that show? The Magicians, and the Fae Queen in that is played by a transgender actress, and she is not transgender in the show at all. She's just a wonderful Fae Queen. And that kind of representation makes me really happy because they don't have to throw in the actress to play, that role. They're just like, you're beautiful. Please play a beautiful Fae Queen. You have a question?
Yeah, how do you all feel about the representation in Dream Daddy?
Ooh. So the question was, how do you all feel about the representation in Dream Daddy? Honestly, like, Dream Daddy was the first game I ever played where I got to make myself in a game. So I understood a lot more about where people were coming from when they were like, oh, I want to see myself in games, because I'd never really thought about it that much because it wasn't ever an option for me. And they handled it really, really, really well, in my opinion. Like, they were subtle, they were clever. They asked all the right questions about whether you'd given birth or your partner had given birth. And it was very, very well done, and it clearly had a lot of research into it. It's one of my favorite games as well. So,
Anyone else have feelings on
and the spooky goth is also trans, so that checks out. I'm just going to move on to another one of the questions. Wait, how many of you gave your favorite characters? Is it just because we don't have enough?
a list of all the characters.
Yeah, Charlie is one.
All right, it's maybe not so much a favorite character exactly, but I really like the representation in The Sims. The latest Sims has gotten a lot better at creating what could be trans characters. So I made myself in The Sims as a trans character, and that was the best. So exactly. So I'm in control, which is also probably a bad thing, but that's fine. I can't think of the worst.
Have any of you ever been uncomfortable giving your pronouns because you're unsure of what they are? I've been uncomfortable giving my pronouns in spaces where I wasn't sure I could be out. When I was younger, I mostly went with he and she, just because I hadn't quite settled on coming out yet. I actually came out once and then went right back in the closet and then came out again. Everyone was very confused. But mostly the only time I'm not comfortable with giving out my pronouns is if I don't know if it's safe for me to do so. Yeah.
It's sort of relevant, but
Good start.
not so much. Kind of. For a while, I first came out as a trans guy, and for a while at work, I didn't come out again as non-binary because I just kind of felt like people wouldn't take it seriously because I'd already come out as something else. Because I flipped from non-binary to a trans guy and then back to non-binary again, and I was like, no one's going to take me seriously. They're just going to be like, Charlie can't decide on their pronouns. Charlie can't decide what they are. But work is actually super supportive, and they were immediately on top of my pronouns and stuff. But there was maybe 3 months of my life where I felt uncomfortable with pronouns being used, and I felt like I couldn't come out with the right ones. Is that relevant?
Yeah.
I think you should show people your tattoos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Charlie has they, them on their knuckle pads, if you can't see them. So my last 2 jobs that I've had, the sort of the first of 2 in sort of like office environments. The last one that I went to, I sort of was identifying as female at the time. So I went in asking them to use she, her pronouns and didn't disclose the fact that I was trans. I was somewhat better at passing at that point in my life because that was a thing I was actively trying to do. And because I was reasonably able to pass, I felt mostly safe, except that I was constantly terrified that someone would be like, actually, what the fuck? Like, it never happened, which is good, but it literally every time I went to work, especially because it was a call center job, I was constantly petrified. And I had customers, especially over the phone. Feminizing your voice is a lot harder. And so I would have customers be like, hey, your name is a clearly feminine name, but you sound like a dude. What the fuck? Are you having a go or something? So that was slightly awkward, but then I left the job and it didn't concern me. And then the job that I'm at currently, my non-games job, as you can probably hear, I am incapable of passing as a cis lady at this point, probably because I'm not. And that's fine. So when I interviewed, I'm like, oh, this is a very, the people at this company barely know what trans is. I'm not going to attempt to come out as non-binary because I don't want to have that fight every day. And so I am out as a trans woman at work. That is what I sort of tell them. And so everyone in my cubicle sort of space is, will refer to me using she, her pronouns, which is uncomfortable but not unbearable. And they just sort of take in stride like, oh, yeah, okay, you're like, we don't think that you're a cis woman, but we will still respect that and treat you as a woman. And I've never had any issues with that, which is very awkward. But also, I work with a bunch of 40-year-olds who work in finance. So pick your battles sometimes. It's exhausting. So that is the road that I have chosen to take.
Pronouns are like shoes.
You can throw them at people.
Sometimes. But I think often it's, and I know we're sort of diverging from the original question, and I think, I don't know if any of us have really experienced specifically the situation that was described. Because there are people who use multiple sets of pronouns, just sort of fluctuating all the time, and that's fine. And I can definitely empathize with the feeling of being gender fluid and sort of not knowing what the shit to do. But in my experience, pronouns are like shoes. Like sometimes you just have to wear the uncomfy ones just because you have to. Like people default to he, him for me, and that's like it sucks. Like I don't like it, but it's something for me is often the path of least resistance, and sometimes that's all I have the energy for. So people I know sometimes fuck it up, and it's like I know they know they're fucking up, and so I just don't make a big deal out of it. But yeah, we're really going far from the original question, aren't we? Pronouns are a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
That's basically my answer.
I'd like to point out something I responded before, which was that every single trans experience is different. And in order to emphasize that, I will answer the question by saying no. Done.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's it.
I would...
glad you went last.
Yeah.
It's a nice note to end on.
Well, it's okay, I was building around.
Haha, I'm going now. I will say on that, there is also a kind of backwards dysphoria you also get if like you're trying out new pronouns and you find they do eventually work for you, but when people first start using them, you're just kind of like,
You gotta wear in the shoes.
oh, yeah, you got to wear in the shoes. That's my expression every time like someone called me he for like the first year I was out. I was just like, that me?
Do you think like a Scooby-Doo villain when you're trying on new pronouns? You're like, oh, I'm just bullshitting people. Like,
Yeah. And it does kind of feel like when people are referring to you by the pronouns you've like been like, hey, I use these now, it does kind of feel to me sometimes that people are doing it to humour me if it's like if it's a fairly new one. So there is a fair bit of discomfort with the new pronouns as well. Thankfully I've been happy with mine for a while. Just gonna pop to Twitter. How do you navigate cis-led events like Women in Games that attempt to include trans and non-binary people, especially as a mask-presenting person?
I don't want to take this because I just turn up.
Yeah. I don't go to them. I noticed you were having a moment. I don't go to them. I sometimes still get invited to them, and personally it feels a bit awful because I'm not a woman and I'm not non-binary, and personally I don't believe I belong in those spaces. But at the same time, there are very few community spaces for like transgender men and like dedicated non-binary spaces within the games community. So you kind of have to take what you can get, or make your own like I did. Shameless plug.
I'm going to try really, really hard to be nice here.
It's a good start.
That's not because I think that people who work in diversity-oriented spaces right now are like necessarily awful at their jobs, or that they're bad people. I don't believe those things, but like personally I've experienced a lot of frustration around very specifically women-led and women-centered spaces, ostensibly like doing outreach but to non-binary people, but not actually following through with anything other than saying that they're welcoming non-binary people. So
Just tacking it on in the name.
yeah, because like if you're running a Women in Games event and also non-binary people are invited, it's not really a welcome space for non-binary people. It's actually a very uncomfy space, and there's always the chance that you're going to turn up and like someone who's not quite with the times is going to be like, what the fuck is a man doing here? And that's terrifying and really uncomfy, and that's why I don't go to these things. However, I do think most people are willing to listen and learn. Maybe you have to tell it to them a dozen times, but it is... and I do empathize with the difficulty of of running diversity-centered spaces. But yeah, personally, I've historically felt very, very uncomfy and like very much like a fraud for even considering going to their spaces. Especially like given the, I still feel weird when people use my actual pronouns. Like that's like I'm a fraud. But
It's a shock.
yeah, it's rough. And so Charlie, Mays, and I have been working hard on advocating, particularly around that. But it is slow work. And also, let's really get into this. It is approaching the brokers of power within these communities is terrifying. It is really, really scary because these people often hold a lot of social power, and you often don't. So it's not just you approaching someone who thinks they're doing great and telling them you're not doing as great as you think you are. It's just this massive amount of emotional energy that you're expending on something which might not have a good response and might end up not just having consequences for you in your advocacy, but as someone who's outside Melbourne, could totally fuck up my career, because as soon as I burn one bridge, I burned like all the bridges, and I no longer have a career in Australia. Thoughts?
This question makes me so tired. I was an admin of a women in games group, which I joined up when I was IDing as female. And when I sort of started moving away from that identity and feeling more comfortable as a non-binary person, I had multiple very uncomfortable conversations where I first had to say, like, do I belong here? Should I still be in this group? And when the sort of like admin group came back and said, yes, and we're committed to making this space safe for people who are both female identified and non-binary, I said, okay, good, then I'm going to push to do what I can to make sure that you live up to that. And I spent the better part of 2 years on the inside of that, pushing back constantly and being like, hey, this thing is bad. You can't do that. Or, hey, actually, can we not do this? Can we please do this? Do I need to wade into conversations that are happening in a more public sphere and kind of be the bad guy, so to speak, and be like, actually, this is not in line with this group's like philosophy, this group's sort of mission statement, and not really getting any support from the rest of the like not any outward support from the rest of the sort of admin crew, which kind of just didn't give me a whole lot of claim to legitimacy there. Meanwhile, like non-binary people in the group would come up to me and say like, hey, I don't feel comfortable here, and I couldn't do anything except say, I'm sorry, I'm trying. There's only so much I can do. Women is in the group's name, and I can't get them to change that. Believe me, I have asked. I've had the same conversation 12 times, and every time it's, oh, yeah, no, we're committed to this. We want to make a difference here. And every time I saw no change, or I saw so little change that it may not have been worth it. And that's not to besmirch the group. Like, I don't want to burn bridges, and there are people doing really good work for specific groups of people. Non-binary people is not one of them, and probably never will be one of them. We're also, like, statistically a minority, so it's kind of hard to say, okay, well, non-binary people go make your own space, and, like, that's a great idea, and, like, Damon and Charlie did that, and it's fantastic, but it doesn't have the social power that a larger, like, women in games group does, because women in games, like, you know, while statistically, again, still not as prevalent as men, are a big enough presence that they can kind of push back and say, hey, the culture needs to change, and for the most part, men will sort of listen and be like, okay, well, we'll give you 10% of that because fuck you. But when it comes to non-binary people, it's so much less than that because most of the time we're struggling to be seen, to be acknowledged in the first place. And when we do get that much, anything else feels like we're often made to feel like we're asking too much. Like, we're letting you use the women's spaces. That's enough, right? Like, you're all the same. You're all going to fit comfortably. Not every non-binary person feels comfortable in a women's space, but what the fuck else are you supposed to do? So, I don't know. There was probably an answer in there. I could talk for a long time about this, but honestly, I'm tired, so...
I'm still kind of a part of a few women in games groups that have the tacked on non-binary, but I've had to, since growing facial hair especially, and looking more and more mask every day, which is great, I love it, but it is counterproductive into fitting into these groups now. So I've kind of had to take a step back because, yeah, as Damon was saying, I'm incredibly worried that someone is going to, if I speak up in one of these groups, because even in my profile picture, I look pretty masked, someone's going to be like, oh no, who let a guy in here? And I don't want that, and I don't want to deal with the consequences of that. So kind of my rule of groups that I will engage in now is kind of, if there isn't a mask-presenting non-binary person at the top, that group probably isn't welcoming for me. I think that's...
Yeah. I think the only thing that I would add, because I apparently haven't talked enough, is it takes a lot of emotional energy just to exist in those spaces when you're not like explicitly a part of what that group is there for, which kind of defeats the purpose of it being a safe space. So...
Question?
Are you guys from, are you from Melbourne or Sydney?
I'm from Adelaide.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Callie and I are from Melbourne.
I moved here earlier this year. I just wanted to also add that personally, like, not as a non-binary person, it always makes me cringe when I see like hey, women, learn to code. Also non-binary people welcome, because it feels like... It feels very tacked on, and so when I saw that the film Victoria Lunch opened up to non-binary people and changed its name so it wasn't the Women in Games Lunch, that was a nice move.
That was actually an important change.
Actually, they have been, Charlie Mays and I have been talking with the Game for Change Lunch people, and they've been really, really helpful. They've been great at listening, and this will be the first year that I actually turn up, because I'm encouraged by the amount that they are willing to listen and make changes based on what we're telling them.
Sorry, that was just like a really sad talk. Positivity back in the end.
I'm really glad you said that, because I'm going tomorrow when I started to feel unsafe as you were talking on there. Because I identify as non-binary, transmasculine, and I'm kind of on the other side where I was really worried when my boss was saying, oh no, it's really inclusive, and I'm saying, but you're saying women and I don't identify as women, so that means when I go along, yes, it's inclusive, but they're going to just keep saying she. And I'm like, then my boss said, look at the invite, and I had to read it, and I said, okay, that's not what you said, I'll go. And I've spoken to one of the organisers, and they didn't gender me the whole time, which was important for me to see, and I thought was good.
Yeah, there'll be pronoun badges, and beatings will continue until morale improves.
One of these days we'll get pronoun badges at every event.
GCAP,
we
you
are
should do this next
opening
time.
up for questions at this point. So if you want to pop your hand up and ask us, we're more than happy to, or you can go through Twitter. Yeah?
Trying to figure out how to phrase this.
Anyway.
What you're talking about with women's spaces tacking on the non-binary, should they just have dedicated women's spaces? Is it that less offensive than just tacking it on? Should there be more a push for more non-binary only spaces, or should they just get better at including non-binary spaces?
I think a resounding yes to all three. I would much rather women's spaces just be women's spaces. If they're not willing to put in the effort to actually include people, then they should stick to what they're good at. Including non-binary people is like extra work.
Also,
But-
like in the IT industry, women's only spaces are very important as well. Like,
Yeah, for
if
sure.
people want to just be doing that, and they do not have like the capabilities or like the resources to do non-binary events as well, then people know when it's tacked on. Basically, we can tell.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think all three of those things is good, and I'd like to see more of that.
Jaris?
Do you think, like, the people organising those women's events, do you think it would be better or more appropriate for them to use their influence or power or their funds even to organise separate women's and separate non-binary events rather than trying to merge them?
Honestly, we'll take anything at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Just at the back.
So I hope this is good place for us. I'm very new to the industry and I have not had a lot of experience with transgender people.
Sorry, could you speak up just a tiny bit?
I'm very new to the industry and I have not had a lot of experience with transgender people. And what I really want to do is make friends and come across politely and whatnot. So I'm wondering what are some very typical assumptions that people make or things that I really should go educate myself about before I completely accidentally ruin any chance of making friends.
Treat trans people like people.
Yep.
And if you know that someone's trans, if you think that someone's trans, that shouldn't make any difference to how you interact with them. That's kind of the easiest way to do it. In terms of like passively being upsetting to trans people, which is definitely possible. Like, transphobia is kind of ingrained into a lot of media and a lot of like standard like ways of communicating. There are definitely like Google exists to avoid that, but also just like if someone does stop you and say, hey, actually, maybe not the coolest thing you could have done, then it's really easy to just be like, oh, cool, we'll do. Never encountered that before. That's fine. You know, we're not an angry mob that will pull out the torches and pitchforks at the smallest slight. If we did that, then, well, we'd be the only ones left because just be respectful, be ready to learn, ready to be told that actually maybe something could have been done better. And if you're like particularly worried, don't necessarily expect every trans person you meet to educate you on the full breadth of the trans experience or any of it, because a lot of us have to do that a lot and it's exhausting. So like, if you're invested in getting that knowledge, Google. There are communities, there are websites, there are comics. Like, that information is readily available. But yeah, other than that, just don't treat trans people like some weird, scary other. We're all just people, and if you treat us like people, then you're probably going to be okay.
We do appreciate it.
Okay, some quick assumptions that often come up is I sometimes see people who have trans friends and then assume that the same thing applies to other trans people they meet. That happens a lot. Like people transitioning don't necessarily have the same defined goals. Not everyone wants surgery. Not everyone wants hormones. And finally, what was the other one? Oh my God, I've forgotten it. I think I'm done. Yeah, that was the assumptions.
That's good.
Yeah.
Question? Just at the back there?
I have another one following on the identification. When trying to make an event that you want, I guess just non-cis white men to come to, like you want to include everyone. What is a good way to, we have like the woman and non-binary, which feels tacked on, doesn't feel inclusive. Is there any ways of calling for people to come, for everyone to come
what you mean. We were, like, me and some other lecturers at work were trying to put together a, like, women in games lunch thing for students. And then we're like, actually, no, also non-binary people. Also, do we just call it the No Cis Men Club? Because, like, that's what we're getting to. And that feels real shitty. So, like, things like Games for Change Lunch is a good name. And then the description tells you what's going on. Like, there's always keywords that give people ideas. Diversity and, minority groups, like there's all kinds of things you can use to describe it that don't limit you to just saying the No Cis Men Club or the Women and Non-Binary and Others Club. It's like, yeah.
I like to, in regards to the how it can sound tacked on with the women and non-binary people, I like to sometimes flip it and be like, put non-binary first, because then, yeah, you're acknowledging that a lot of the time non-binary does feel tacked on, and you're making like an active step into saying, no, we are directly thinking about you. I think that's all I have to say.
Do we have time for one more? Just one more? Yeah, just here.
As a supporter, I've heard nothing based on for those that like the sport. Going back to the initial talk about pronouns, it comes up often in related that the person I'm talking to is slipping up on the pronoun, and the way I correct them is that when I change the gender to them, so they'll be going something and not making a big deal of it. So as a sport, it's again, don't make a big deal of it and just gently.
I tend to not make a big deal out of it, so I'll basically just, if somebody else is misgendering somebody, I'll just correct them, and then if they don't get the hint, I'll go, actually, they go by this.
You can pull someone aside and do that real quietly without causing a big scene as you yell someone's pronouns across a room.
Yeah.
I would much prefer that someone, just in terms of like emotional energy, I would much prefer that someone not bring that up like during the conversation. Like absolutely, like take them aside, be like, hey, I'm pretty sure this person uses these pronouns. Like that is A+. Like, excellent, please do that. It's very, very helpful.
I think that's all we have time for, so thank you so much for coming down, and thank you to my panelists.